Okay, let's start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the INVIRCAT Open Day of the Simulation Campaign. I'm Paola Lanzi from the Blue, and I'm the communication lead of this project. In this role, I'm very happy to welcome you to this event that we really wanted to organize as consortium to share with our external audience this extensive simulation campaign that we carried out in the last months of last year, November, December 2021. I just want to say thank you for being here with us. I want to thank the SJU for, first of all, for suggesting the idea of this open day and also for being with us today. Since I'm also the chair of the advisory board, I cannot forget our advisory board members. So I want to thank also the numerous members of the INVIRCAT advisory board that are here with us today, and the representatives of our related projects that with us are part of the RPS group panel. Just a few instructions before we start this open day. As you probably have noticed, the event is being recorded, but we don't plan as project to share this recording to external audiences. The recording will just be for us for an internal purpose. So feel free, we are not sharing your videos or you talking and so on. Concerning questions, you will see that we will share the agenda later on, but you will see that this open day has been designed in order to have many different sessions in which you can intervene and ask questions. There are two ways for you to ask questions. You can write them in the dedicated question box, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and allow you to speak and ask your question. Please don't use the chat for your questions because we are not monitoring the chat for this purpose. So we may miss some of the questions there. I think just a very final information from my side concerning the materials that you will see today, in particular the presentations. They are not available on this platform and they have not been shared with you yet by email, but will be available soon on our website and social media. So as soon as we make all this material available online, you will receive an email that will inform you about the availability of all this material, and you can profit by this to have a second look at everything. I finished here my very brief introduction, and I'm very pleased to give the floor to Gunnar Josh from DLR, who is our project coordinator, and will introduce us to the project and to this validation campaign. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. Yes, my name is Gunnar Schwoch. Thank you for being here. I welcome you to this open day of the INVIRCAT project. It's good to have you here. And with me, as Paula also already said, are colleagues from the project, and especially the simulation hosts who will tell us about the simulation activities in their respective simulation departments. Today we'll be focused on the validation exercises and the real-time simulations coming with that. The project is a bit more, so I will try to give a brief introduction so you know why we did all of these simulation activities. You will see some details of the different simulation campaigns and some videos with that. You can ask questions, as Paula said, during the or after the respective presentations. And there will be a dedicated session afterwards where we will conclude and summarize what we saw. And there is another questions and answers session attached to that. So feel free to either raise your hand or write down the questions in the questions box. The INVIRCAT project started in 2020, and it has the main objective of enabling the integration of remotely piloted aircraft systems within terminal maneuvering areas and airports under instrument flight rules. That is a bit lengthy title, and if you're not used to the terminology in this area of research, it may look very confusing. Let me state that, and you see some examples on the bottom right, that we don't look at small drones and integration of that into lower airspaces. That's what other projects do. We look at bigger aircraft that are flown unmanned and how they can be integrated into current operations at an airport. These are just examples, so we look at a generalized introduction of those. We have several bullet points identified as objectives. One of them is to create a concept of operations for these IFR RPAS in TMAs and airports. We look at the requirements that go with it. So what is required from the technical and the operational point of view to facilitate this integration. We also look at the ground control stations that are required to control such a drone. And we look at a very, the very last thing there is to look at the use space benefits we might get from use space research or give back to use space. Use space is what I talked about a bit. So the integration of drones and whatever is flown unmanned in lower airspaces mainly. The project schedule, as I said, we started in 2020 and we finalized our validation activities last year, end of last year. We worked towards these validation exercises by creating a state-of-the-art document. So we looked at what is out there and we collected use cases. How can this concept be applied, and what are the use cases? Why do we do all of that? Then we drafted an initial concept of operations and a requirements list. And with that said, we went into this validation exercises and tried to see if it is applicable, if it's realistic, and what may be missing. So that's what we are right now at. And the next step will be to create a final version out of these documents. So the concept of operations and the requirements list, and of course, wrap all of that up in a conclusions and recommendations phase, also producing public deliverables that you can look at. That will happen in July, and afterwards we will try to disseminate our results the best we can. So the project ends at the end of 2022, and we will try to bring our results to the public. The validation exercises, as I said, are more or less in the middle of the project, and they are fed by the concept of operations. You can download that on our public webpage. And the preliminary requirements definition, they went into the creation of these validation exercises. There were many other deliverables necessary for that as well, detailing the infrastructure and the use cases, the detailed description, and how we assess what we are simulating. But yeah, that won't be detailed right now, but the result will be the final versions of those documents. Just some more words about today's agenda. So we had the welcome from Paula and myself right now. Afterwards, Gabriela from ISNOVA will talk about the validation approach. So what are the objectives? What do we want to achieve and how can we achieve that? And afterwards, there will be 3 blocks of our simulation campaign because the validation exercises were split into 3 different campaigns for several reasons, some of them quite obvious these days. So my colleague Niels from DLR will start with the DLR simulation campaign and share some initial results and impressions. And afterwards, Jürgen from NLR will follow with the NLR real-time simulation and share some insights and a video. Then we will have a quite short break, and afterwards we will see the last but not least simulation report from Ricardo from CIRA, telling us what they did with their simulation. And afterwards, the final block will be a wrap up of what we saw today, and you will again have the opportunity to post questions and discuss it with us. That's it from my side. So I will hand over now to Gabriela, who will talk about the validation objectives and approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunnar. Okay, now should we be able to see my screen? Okay, so welcome again. I'm Gabriela Duca from ISNOVA, and I'll introduce you the general overview of how we design and manage this simulation. Let me check how can I, okay. I just had to shrink my control box. So this overview will let you introduce it on our validation objectives, the assumption that we made to design the exercise, but even the CONOPS of INVIRCAT projects. Then we will have some overview of how we physically arrange the simulations, the comparison about the objectives and the scenarios variables that we merged and combined for the 3 simulations, and finally how we collected and managed the data collection in order to assess the validation, the extent on which we match the validation objectives. So just a brief introduction about this very relevant part of our project, because the simulation campaign is part of the work package 3, which addresses the preparation, the conduct, and the analysis of the simulation results. And the main purpose of the simulation campaign, this quite complex simulation campaign, is to validate the INVIRCAT concept of operation. And this means that the simulation campaign addresses the operational scenarios, procedures, and the technologies that have been considered in this operational concept. Then, for sure, we follow this overall goal through several steps. The first step is the definition of validation objectives to understand what are the needs and the requirements for the implementation of the simulation. And this is the starting point of our simulation validation strategy. Then after that, we had the need to define the validation environment needed to perform such validation, and this was driven, let's say, by the use case that were selected as key use cases to demonstrate the INVIRCAT concept. After that, we produced detailed simulation plans, exercise plans for each of the 3 simulations planned in our project. And finally, we executed such exercises, and today we will show you the detailed arrangements and the initial results. Finally, the last step of this overall validation campaign is for sure the analysis of the results, and this is the step where we are engaged in these times. As said also by Gunnar, this is a very relevant part of the project, and for these reasons, it is supported by many scientific deliverables. Some of these deliverables are already available from our websites, and the last public deliverables will be available as soon as they are published. So please feel free after this event to take note about the links if you will need some more information. Going on, what are the validation objectives? The validation objectives refer mainly to 4 key performance areas: for sure safety, then human performances. Then we address the operational efficiency through the runway throughput metric, and access and equity that we manage through the equitable delay, managing of delay among all the airspace users. All the exercise relies on these common validation objectives and also on common validation assumptions. All the validation objectives cover both nominal conditions and contingency situations. As you can see, many of the definition of the assessment objectives incorporates the word acceptability, because this is a human in the loop activity, so the key feedback can come also mainly from the human involved in this kind of exercise. And acceptability in our cases concerns the operation in the broadest meaning, safety level, automatic takeoff and landing procedures, latency and issues concerning C2Link and radio communication, handover procedures, phraseology, the provision of information to both remote pilots and air traffic controllers, human contribution of both this role to the tasks and operations execution, and of course workload. For each validation objective, so for sure we needed to define at least one success criteria. And again, given the human in the loop nature of this activity, many of the success criteria are positive feedback from air traffic controllers and remote pilots. For sure, for more quantitative metrics such as frequency issues and radio throughput and equitable delay, we relied on data log, and then we collected quantitative and objective data from the simulation platforms. Again, the common framework is also made by the assumptions that we produced at the initial stage of the project during the preparation of the INVIRCAT concept. And this is also basing on technical considerations that we made during the initial scientific and technical survey steps of our project. In practical aspects of our simulation, consider for sure the facilities that we have available and we have configured to support this project activity. The key partners of the exercises are DLR, NLR, and CIRA, which contributed with their simulation environments so that we have a common architectural design that was configured with specific ad hoc settings in order to address the several validation objectives that we wanted to address. But the common aspects are for sure the existence of a flight simulator platform in each of the facilities, an air traffic management simulator, that consists of a controller working position, traffic scenarios generator, and positions for pseudo pilots managing the surrounding traffic in the purpose of the exercise. Then we have 3 different simulation campaigns, as said, And each campaign focused on specific variables and objectives that we want to address. For what concerns the CIRA exercise, the main focus was on takeoff, approach, and landing steps, considering automatic takeoff and landing. And this included the execution of a reference scenario without RPAS, several nominal use cases, several ATOL failures, C2-link failures, the managing of conflict situations, and the confront between two different latency levels. In terms of nominal conditions, we explore the takeoff with different latency level, the ATOL approach and landing with different latency levels. For what concerns the contingency, we investigated the ATOL contingency during the takeoff with a rejected takeoff, the ATOL contingency during the landing step with a consequent distant approach go around procedure. And then in terms of conflicts, we had scenarios where a traffic controller detected a conflict during the takeoff with a rejected takeoff as consequence, and a conflict during the landing with a runway incursion. And then finally, the C2-link failure was explored during the approach in a scenario foreseeing the possibility to recover the link. For what concerns the exercise executed by DLR, the focus here is on departure and arrival phases. And also in this case, we included a reference scenario without RPAS, several nominal use cases, C2-link failures, a transponder failure with different latencies, and several conflict situations. In this case, nominal scenarios included one RPAS or multiple RPAS. The scenarios with one RPAS was tested with different latency levels. Then we have C2-link failure for one or for multiple RPAS, the simulation of a transponder failure for one RPAS, and a conflict occurring with involvement of only one RPAS. In terms of focus and goals of NLR exercise, we here have a focus on latency aspects and different technologies available for RT communication. So in this case, we explored for sure a nominal condition without RPAS, several nominal use cases, RT communication voice loss, C2-link and RT latencies, and conflict situation. In this case, we have nominal condition with one or multiple RPAS, always with low latency. We explored RT failure in departure, arrival, and approach and landing phases. We explored the same conditions with C2-link latency. Then we have different kind of latency linked to different technologies exploitable to RT communication. Then we have a conflict in departure stage during BR loss operations. So we have a conflict during the arrival phase during BR loss operation. And in this specific case, we also tested the handover between remote pilot stations during the loiter maneuver and along seat until the last segment of the seat. All this allowed us to cover the scenario variables in terms of propulsion failures, failure of aircraft systems, and specific conflict situations that are managed by air traffic controllers, covering all the validation objectives. The decision to split to address specific condition was made based on the fact that in this case we can explore a lower number of variables and then better comparing the relevance of such a variable in a scenario in order to derive the most suitable requirements and recommendation based on practical evidence from the results of the simulation. Then all that has been made in order to collect data, as said, in order to provide evidence of the achievement of the validation objectives. We collected qualitative and quantitative data. This data is also of subjective and objective nature. Objective data comes from data log managed by our platform engineer, and other data comes from free discussion, let's say, and questionnaires involving air traffic controllers and remote pilots, providing their subjective opinion and feelings about the experience they have done during our simulation. In a little bit more detail, we have collected data in three different steps. During the execution of the simulation, data log were recorded and are now under analysis by our platform engineers. After each simulation run or small group of run, we have conducted focus group, and we have collected data through post-run questionnaires, which have been differentiated by for ATCOs and pilots, the questionnaires, and this has been managed in order to understand what are the dynamics and of the specific events that have been experienced by humans in the loop in this exercise, and to understand also to collect with a quantitative approach confrontable measures on what human actors have experienced. At the end of each simulation campaign, a further data collection step has been implemented, and the focus group involving controllers, air traffic controllers and remote pilots has been conducted in order to understand if we met the validation objective under a more general perspective, what are the reasons of the results, understanding the motivation and the rationale behind the common dynamics or events that have been experienced by involved people. With a little bit different scope to understand and to confront different scenario variables, we have collected also quantitative subjective data through the post-exercise questionnaires. For the preparation of questionnaire, we relied on both standard tools such Channel X situational awareness questionnaire, Bedford scale for workload, and so on. But since we had the goal to understand the specific role, relevance, and impact of specific technical variables, we also designed ad hoc questions for both post-exercise and post-run questionnaires in order to collect quantitative matrix data about these specific variables. From my side, that's all. So I think that I can pass the ball to, let's say, probably most interesting presentation of this morning, since my colleague Niels from DLR will show you the execution of a DLR simulation.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriela.
Okay. Niels, now you should be the presenter.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, thank you again. Let's start this. There we are. Yeah, thank you from my side again, Gabriela. Today, I will talk a bit about our real-time simulation conducted at DLR, and Gunnar will also jump in to give a bit more brief information about the RPAS and some special issues. So let's start. First of all, within 4 days, our real-time simulation was conducted during the second week of November 2021. Therefore, we used the air traffic validation center in Braunschweig And this campaign mainly focused at DLR on the integration of RPAS into the IFR arrivals within the TMA and assessing for these objectives the impact on ATCs, and there regardingly mainly the latency, how adequate our procedures are, and what actually happens if the C2 link or any control link is missing or lost. For the beginning, we want to give you a short insight and also an impression on the facility we used. So in our case, it's the Atmos for the air traffic working positions. On the right-hand side, you can see several working positions provided for the controllers. In our case, for the simulations, we only used one, but there are the possibilities to use more. Then there are also pseudopilot stations in the back to control and also monitor the aircrafts and communicate with the air traffic controller. And also a working position here in the front left back to monitor the whole project. Some more impressions beyond that. We also use the RPAS simulation platform embedded in this DLR Air Traffic Validation Center, shortly called UFly. It's allowing to monitor and control one or multiple RPAS. Now we see on the right-hand side one of the pictures taken during the simulation itself. It's one of our colleagues simulating one of those RPAS, having several displays in front of him to control and monitor, as I said, and also one picture from the view back to get an impression how it looked like. Now in the following, we will give a brief overview of what our simulation at DLR covered and how we basically built the setup and the scenarios we simulated itself. So in total, we conducted 4 validation days. On each validation day with a different air traffic controller, in our case from Rome, Milano, and Bologna. They all had 8 different scenarios to simulate in the simulation campaign itself, and also 5 different contingency events. More information for that in the following. Exemplary, there is a timetable on the left-hand side for one of our validation days, so you get an impression how it looked like. In total, this all yield to 32 validation runs for the whole campaign. Let's have a more precise look on our simulation setup and also the components. First of all, we chose Düsseldorf Airport and the approach as an international medium or high size airport. For the right-hand side, here there's a part of our arrival chart for the approach. There, especially, it's to emphasize the typical trombone structure of the airspace for medium or high traffic airports. The airport is located next to the Regno point you see in the middle of the chart. Secondly, there was a baseline scenario constructed based on traffic recorded for Düsseldorf in 2019 before COVID, with a traffic volume of approximately 35 aircrafts per hour or movements per hour. Then in the following, up to 3 selected aircrafts in this scenario have been replaced by remotely piloted systems. And additionally to those systems, there were those Gabriele already introduced, RPAS specific scenario events to inject in those scenarios. All in all, this provides 8 available scenarios for each air traffic controller on a validation day to simulate. Now Gunnar will jump in to give some information about the RPAR.
Yeah, thank you, Niels. So we have some assumptions in the project. You saw a list presented by Gabriela earlier, and some of them, or all of them, were taken into our simulation exercises as well, and we had to do or decided to put some more assumptions in our case. So these are the most important ones probably. Our flight envelope was a fixed wing structure, as in all of the project, and in this very case we selected a Dornier 228 that has historical reasons, one may say, because one of our research aircraft is a Dornier 228 and a Boeing 737. So you could assume them to be some cargo unmanned aircraft modified to be flown unmanned. In our transponder failure case, we said the transponder modes Charlie and Sierra are inoperative, so the only thing the air traffic controller will see on his display is a primary radar blip and no more information on altitude or speeds. The high C2 latency, we did extensive research on what that actually means, and it depends on the architecture. In our case, we said it's up to 2 seconds delay on the control commands. Notably is that we didn't put any latency effect on the communication link, so we assume that to be radio line of sight and with only low latency. And our colleagues at NLR took a deeper look on communication latency added to the simulation. So in our case, it was only C2 latency. And in case of a C2 link loss, we assumed the RPA to automatically switch to 7400 for the transponder code, which is introduced by ICAO as a squawk code for loss of control link at an RPA of an RPA. So that is taken into the simulation and automatically activated from the RPA side. And if a C2 link fails, some loiter areas, and I will get back to that, will automatically activate. Some more information for the air traffic controller. When he came to our facilities, we introduced him with the idea of the C2 latency. So he was told that he might encounter some delayed response. We didn't put any numbers, although it is on the slide for your information, but we didn't put any exact number to that. So he might expect some delay. We didn't tell him when or where, but yeah. And as I said, voice communication was not affected by latency. We also said the squawk will be set to 7400, and this will be represented in his controller working position by a certain visual cue. You will see that later. It is a red label of the RPA in his controller working position display. And he was asked to reintegrate the RPAS when the C2 link has been regained. So the procedure was that the RPAS will enter the emergency loiter area, and afterwards, after the C2 link has been regained, he was asked to not forget about it, but reintegrate it and land it safely. In the transponder failure case, that is a bit special because it is not really only happening in RPAS operations, but in that case, we put some assumptions that, as I said before, Charlie and Sierra transponder modes are inoperative and he can only see the primary radar blip on his screen. And he was asked to use the loiter areas when transponder failure happens, which is not very natural to most air traffic controllers. I will talk about that in our preliminary findings, but he was at least asked to use the loiter areas because we wanted to see the effect and if it really helps to have them at hand. And the air traffic controller also was told that the remote pilot can enter and leave the loiter area at all times because he has still full control of his RPA. Something else that we created while putting up the simulation is some proposed phraseology, because we want to see if it's required to have an extensive addition to phraseology or if it is okay with natural speaking. So our proposed phraseology in the C2 link loss case was, as you can see on the screen, so the remote pilot will be informed on his remote pilot station that the C2 link is lost, of course, and in fact the position of the RPA is not updated on his screen, so he really sees a frozen display and he's notified by a pop-up. The remote pilot will contact air traffic control if not already air traffic control has seen the red label and contacted the remote pilot earlier. The remote pilot knows which loiter area will be used because it's pre-programmed in the RPA and also available, this information, at the remote pilot station. So although he does not see the RPA go towards some loiter area, he knows what it should be doing. And the remote pilot can also state some loiter flight parameters, as we called it. So pre-programmed were also flight altitudes for these loiter areas and speeds. That became a bit problematic or insightful, we could say. I will also talk about that later on. And you can see the proposed phraseology there. Yeah. No, it's fine. It's just some speech of air traffic control and the remote pilot. Those are exemplary loiter areas. I want to highlight exemplary, so don't show that to some Düsseldorf approach controller and tell him that this is what he will use, because there will be probably some procedural problems coming with that when you take into account surrounding sectors, for example. This is what we went with as a preliminary and exemplary approach for loiter areas. So you can see the loiter area November, Sierra, and Whiskey. And depending on the flight phase and the approach that the RPA that encounters this C2 link loss is in, the loiter area will be selected, and the RPA will automatically enter this loiter area. And back to you, Niels, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Here we provide you some more pictures taken during the campaign to get an impression. On the left-hand side, there are two pictures for two different air traffic controllers conducting the simulations itself. You can see our monitor, the HMI and the radar, how they monitor the traffic and also give comments to the pseudopilots. And on the right-hand side, we have two different pictures. The top picture is already like a sneak peek to the video we will show in the following. It's the C2 link loss, and the label, as Gunnar already said, will be colored reddish, so the air traffic controller knows what's going on. And there's the second picture provided on the right-hand side. It's our pseudopilots conducting the simulation itself as well. We can see the HMI, the radar screen itself, and also the flight strips for the pseudopilots to control and also to give comments to the aircraft itself. Now there will be another picture for our U-Fly you already saw in the beginning. It's one of our colleagues doing the simulation itself. You see the different screens in front of him. So there's a middle screen to control the RPAS or the multiple RPAS and to give comments and adjust the flight route. And there's also another screen on the right-hand side. It's his planning screen to have an overview of the airspace structure and what the procedures are for the loiter areas, for example. Now we will provide two different videos for one chosen example. As a scenario, we chose the C2 link loss. So first of all, you will see a video from the radar screen of the CVP, so the controller working position. I will leave some comments on that, so you will get an explanation of what happens actually and what the air traffic controller will see. And then in the following, we will provide another perspective for this scenario as well. It's from our U-Fly, and Gunnar will leave some comments on that. So let me see how this works here. So before I start the video, this is the basically the airspace we saw in the beginning of the presentation. We have several aircrafts inside the airspace right now, 3 different RPAS lighted high light green. It's a Speedbird, Lufthansa, and a Finnair. and our runway and airport more or less centered in the picture right now. Okay, now I'm back. And now we'll see that the traffic, will go further, and the highlight green RPAS will, gain a C2 link loss. So they will turn reddish, like it's happening right now, and go automatically to the predefined areas, as Gunnar said in the beginning, and loiter in those areas. This is the C2 link loss. So the air traffic controller will be in contact with the pseudo-pilots, exchanging information and knowing what's going on. Now in the second part, you see all the three RPAS loitering in the areas. They are predefined, and the air traffic controller has to adjust his arrival sequence for new arrivals and the RPAS itself. Now on the top, our Speedbird 1621 has a regain of his C2 link loss, and he's communicating with the RPAS itself after he sent the squawk, and he will be integrated in the arrival sequence and stream itself. Now he will leave the loiter area on top, as we saw in the picture from Gunnar, and he will be integrated in our stream again. The other two RPAS on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side still keep in those loiter areas and further proceed those. Now the Speedbird is heading towards 180 and gaining back on the final, where you see the other aircraft landing already. This was a short impression how the air traffic controller saw the event happening. Now we will provide the different perspective. And Gunnar will jump in to leave some comments.
Yeah, thank you, Niels. It works. So you can see the exact same situation that you saw earlier in the controller working position now from the remote pilot's point of view. So you see the Speedbird, the British Airways 1621, turning into final. You see the control panel that can be used by the remote pilot on the left-hand side of the screen. He has an overview of the subsystems of the RPA under control. He has a flight plan widget where he can select waypoints and he can monitor it on this map. We have different backgrounds, so don't be confused by the satellite standard view. And the remote pilot will be informed in case anything happens to the RPA by a notification box that will pop up soon. There it is. So it says C2 link is lost and please inform ATC, and what loiter area is activated. You can see it while the remote pilot is checking that on the screen, that the loiter area popped up, and now the second link is lost and the loiter area CIRA is activated, and we assumed a major infrastructure breakdown, so even the third link is lost and the remote pilot sees all his three RPAs not under control anymore. Fortunately, one of these RPAs regains control, so it will be, as you already saw in the screen, the Speedbird 1621 in loiter area November, and the remote pilot again is notified that the link is regained, and he sees the updated position of the Speedbird on his screen, and he contacts ATC and reports the regained link, as you saw in the proposed phraseology slide. And what ATC did there, or they are free to do what they see fit, but what they did there is a short standby, and the RPA continued the loitering pattern. And when the air traffic controller sees that it is possible to reintegrate, he tells the remote pilot how to do so. In this case, he gave the Speedbird 161 a heading command instruction on fly heading 160. So it has been selected on the left-hand side. You can see the Speedbird turn towards 160 heading now, and then wait for interception of the extended final. And I think a direct to the final approach fix. So that is what it looked like on the screen of the remote pilot. This is a good opportunity to state that it is not in our concept that the remote pilot has to control 3 RPAs at once in an approach phase, which is quite stressful or very critical flight phase, probably the most critical flight phase. So we had, when we assessed the remote pilot actions, we took care that it's only one of them. But this was, let's say, an example of what could happen if you extend it too far and have 3 communication losses in approach for one remote pilot. Yeah, thank you, Niels. I think you have to go back to the slides somehow.
Yeah, you should see the slide already. You're not?
No, still the video on my side at least.
Okay.
Yeah,
there we are.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, some preliminary results can be presented. As Gabriela already said, we are working on really looking through everything we collected, and it is quite a big number of things to look at. So these are not complete, most probably, but maybe main or important feedback that we collected. For example, was the air traffic controller feedback, and all of those 4 controllers said that the encountered latency on the communication link, on the control link, so C2 latency, was not considered to be an issue. Some of them said if it is a real dense situation, you might encounter a slow reaction and it can be impactful, but then again, some slow reaction is common in current manned operations as well. So these additional 2 seconds that we put on the C2 latency was not really seen as problematic by the air traffic controllers. It can be a quite slow reaction by the pilot or something else. So this was not an issue as they said. The loiter areas we introduced were considered helpful. All of them said it is very helpful to have it as a last resort. So whenever something happens to the RPA or is problematic with the RPAS, they are sure that they can take this loiter area and assign it to some RPAS to get it out of the way, as one of them said. So that was just good for them to have as a backup. And the indication of RPAS, you have seen that they had a slightly different greenish color. The air traffic controller said that that was sufficient for them. So we didn't have a, I don't know, bigger label or some extra text in that label stating that this is an RPAS. It was just another color. Of course, if you have something else than our modified assumptions of modified passenger aircraft, the air traffic controller might see it in the aircraft type, but they said it's no problem, and that was a good way of presenting what is new. One thing that I already touched in my introduction when I talked about the loiter areas was that when we created these loiter areas, we assigned a fixed altitude to them, assuming some flight level that is common in those phases. Now, what happened is that the air traffic controllers assigned an altitude already to some RPA on the downwind leg, so in the trombone phase of the airspace structure there. And then when the C2 link was lost and the RPA was automatically assigned with a loiter area, the RPA began to either climb or descend, which was not helpful. So that was a very irritating thing for the air traffic controllers. They said, or they thought, this RPA is on 5,000 feet, and then the programmed procedure was flight level 70 in this loiter area whiskey, for example. And then the RPA began to climb, and that was irritating for the air traffic controller. So that was one main thing that we took out of these simulations, that the air traffic controller's assigned altitude should be kept while entering this loiter area. Of course, you have, when you have contingencies and you have loiter areas used by different RPAs, you will have to give it a second thought then. Another thing was that the air traffic controllers did not feel the need to see the loiter areas at all times, because in regular normal operations they wouldn't need to use it, so they prefer to have some on-off switch for these loiter areas in their controller working position. Some more observations that we made while looking at the simulations and how they went. The loiter areas were there, and the air traffic controllers were provided with the possibility to use them whenever they see the need for. They did not do that at all. So other than the automatic activation during the C2 link loss, these loiter areas were not used by the air traffic controllers. One air traffic controller said, when I asked him about that, he said, well, it is an aircraft in the airspace, and I want to handle it just as the other ones, no matter if it's unmanned or not. So he really said the equity, his approach is to handle the air traffic exactly the same, no matter what aircraft or RPAS it is. So he didn't thought of using it. The transponder failure, as you might remember, the air traffic controllers were asked to use the loiter areas in case of transponder failure, and the rate was 50-50. So 2 of the air traffic controllers remembered that during their operations and used the loiter areas. 2 of them didn't. And when asked about that, they said, it is not a big deal to have a transponder failure if you have a corresponding remote pilot or pilot. You ask him what is his indicated altitude, and then you just bring him home, and that is not a big, of course it has some impact, but it is manageable. And they said it's better to get them out of the way and not have the loiter area and wait for a potential transponder regain. So yeah, that was also one result. And we didn't talk about that too much, but there are holding patterns available in the downwind legs in the trombones, and they were free to use it also, of course, for RPAS if required. They only did that in one occasion. So one of our scenarios was a conflict situation, which is not too easy to create if you have a good air traffic controller with a good way of handling the air traffic. It can be difficult to force a conflict situation. That's what we also learned. And in one occasion, we were very successful, and the air traffic controller tried to get the aircraft out of the way and used the holdings, but apart from that, it was not used at all.
Okay. Finally, I would also like to leave some comments on our KPIs, so the key performance indicators and our measurements we use for those. Basically, we have the three main KPIs of safety, equity, and capacity. Also, Gunnar already talked about. And those we measured by our data from the simulations. So how were the required separations? Are there any compliances? How are the mean flown distances for RPAS and also for the conventional aircrafts? And also a number of touchdowns will be taken into account. Further, we also try to measure the workload. This is done by the ISAR. It's the instantaneous self-assessment of workload. I don't know if you noticed, but during the video of the CPV, there was a small window popping up in yellow in the lower part of the video. This is basically the scale for the ISAR, for the air traffic controllers, where they have to rate their workload within the last 5 minutes on a scale from 1 to 5. And this is coming up every 5 minutes. So you get an impression for the situation, how the workload or how the air traffic controller assesses his own or her own workload. And additionally, there were also several questionnaires done by us for each scenario. So after each simulation run itself, and then also after the whole validation day. Those included different scales Gabriella already talked about. So there was a 5-point Likert scale for general questions, also the CARS, an accepting rating scale, the Shiner Late scale for situation awareness, and addition to our ISA during the campaign was also an adapted BAT4 scale to evaluate how the workload has been. And to conclude, here you will see a final sneak peek of our data analysis. It's just a small insight shown here, the analysis of the mean flown distances for our final simulation day, so the 12th of November, for the conventional aircraft only right now, regarding to all the initial approach fixes seen on the right-hand side. It's TEPO, SAMOT, and DOMUX. The results are shown for all the 8 scenarios we introduced. And now the next step will be to get the results and the comparison of those conventional results to the RPAS results, and also assess and the explain KPIs. So far, as we can say, there's the same behavior seen in the RPAS itself. So there's no really different handling of the RPAS in the airspace. And we can tell that those show the same behavior. That's it from our side. Thank you for your attention, and we are now happy to answer all your questions you got for the DLR real-time simulation.
Yeah, we already received some. Thank you, Nils, for the good presentation. So yeah, feel free to post any questions you might have. And we already have some, and I think 2 of them can be answered in one answer. So Giovanni asks, so are you considering two separate channels, one for C2 link and another for communication link? In this way, are you considering a ground-ground communication link network between RP and air traffic control, RP remote pilot, sorry, and air traffic control? And Olivia asks a quite related question. In RPAS operations today, there is often a noticeable latency of voice communications with ATC because the voice comes through the C2 link and retransmitted by the RPA. Can you provide some background on the rationale for the setup with C2 latency, but no latency for voice communications? And I don't know if you want to answer that, Niels, or I can.
You can go ahead.
Do that. So it is true. We consider two separate channels and two separate links. And in our case, in the DLR simulation case, we just put the latency on the C2 link. We have different combinations investigated in other simulations, so you will hear about that a bit later, and maybe then post a follow-up question to that. But in our case, we assumed that the C2 link might carry some latency because the remote pilot is not located right next to the arrival airport. So in the optimal case, let's say, and what we propose to be the optimal case is to have the remote pilot located near the arrival airport, and that would require, in most cases, that the control of the RPA is handed over to an arrival remote pilot, as you might call him, at the arrival airport. And when he's located, he or she is located at the arrival airport or near the arrival airport, the remote pilot would have a radio line of sight connection for the C2 link. And in the optimal case, it would be a ground-ground connection from remote pilot to air traffic control. So landline connection, just pick up the phone as you do nowadays, and then have a landline connection without latency, or at least with very low latency, only the system latency, and then light speed to air traffic control. In the non-optimal case, which is also possible, of course, the remote pilot is not located near the RPA, so it is a flight to a distant arrival airport, and for some reason there is no transfer to an arrival remote pilot at the destination. So the link could be via satellite. And then our research said, okay, it will be around 2 seconds on the C2 link, but nevertheless we assumed this landline connection from remote pilot to air traffic control to be in place. So the distance from remote pilot to the RPA is too big to have radio line of sight connection, so it uses satellite connection, and the voice communication is still possible to be of low latency. That was our assumption and our selection for the DLR use cases. We then looked at other things from the project objectives, and I know that in the NLR presentation you will see the architectures which will help in understanding what I said, so how the connection looks like. That is a long answer, and I hope it was clear. If not, just raise your hand, come on stage, or feel free to add another question to the chat box. I see one more question, Niels. That is, Giovanni asks, why did you not distinguish on the controller working position an RPAS from manned aircraft? I see the same icon or symbol used for both RPAS and manned aircraft.
Yeah, I can answer on that. I mean, it's related to our radar screen, right? Basically, we try to consider a different symbol, but since the points on our radar screen are so small, in conversation with all the air traffic controllers, they considered no big difference if there is a triangle or an arrow or anything like that. So for them, it's more important to see the difference in the label and also in the coloring, so they get a quick response on what's happening, and that there's no such big importance to the point or the triangle on the radar, since they are so small.
Yeah, and what we did, and I think it is visible on, maybe you can guess it. No, they are all red. So you may have seen that before in the video, that the color of the text, it has a different type of green on it. So if you want to see the difference, you can see it without being too distracted by flashy yellow or something. So we try to make a subtle indication that it is possible to see that it is an RPAS and not a conventional manned aircraft, but we try to make it as little distracting as possible, I would say. And this approach was welcomed by the air traffic controllers, at least.
They said it's suitable.
One related question that I don't see in the chat, but that you might have, is how does the communication look like? So when the RPAS enters the TMA and makes radio contact to the air traffic control, he might also indicate that he's a remote pilot or he's controlling an RPAS. When we instructed our remote pilots, we said just make a regular initial call and let's see if it has any impact. So the remote pilot, when contacting ATC, he indicated his call sign, of course, and where he's at and what flight level he's at and what his intentions are. And then air traffic control just said, yeah, radio contact established or identified, and then gave him instructions for the approach and landing. And we did not put any keyword in this initial call. So there was no indication of the remote pilot that he is remote and not located inside the aircraft. So the only thing that the air traffic controller was provided with was, as I said, this indication. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was also a question in the feedback round and also in the questionnaires, if they are aware that, or if they were aware that this is a remotely piloted aircraft at all times, if required. I mean, if there is no problem with the RPA, maybe you don't want to be reminded at all times that this is now remotely controlled, because in the ideal case, you wouldn't have to care. One more question. Yeah, so Olivia asks, in RPAS, C2 links are relatively frequent, but most times they are very short, so that activating the LL, lost link procedure for loitering, might be an overkill. What is your view on the parameter for a minimum length of the lost link before activating the lost link procedure and proceeding to the loitering? That is a very good question, Olivia. And to be clear, we didn't assess that. So that is a probably very worthy parameter to assess what is acceptable. I don't have a feeling right now, and I did not do extensive research on that, how long. So you say they are very short. I'm not really sure what very short means. Maybe it's 1-2 seconds. Of course, you should wait for some seconds before you activate a lost link procedure. Yeah, maybe someone can jump in and help me if he has knowledge of numbers that are used, but in our simulations, this parameter was not investigated. So it is worth taking with us and taking into account for the next iterations of our documentation. Very good, thank you. I don't see any more questions, so I'll
Neither.
Maybe 2 more minutes. Let's wait for that. And closing remarks for our simulations would be that we were very satisfied with how it went, I think. Niels, what do you think?
Yeah, from our side.
Yeah, so we were a bit, I was on the remote pilot side and Niels was more on the air traffic control and pseudo pilot at the same time side of the simulations. They were in separate rooms, so we really had to walk a bit to see each other. So that was a real distance of the remote pilot and air traffic control also in reality. And we had some hindrances while organizing it, or at least challenges, because it wasn't sure whether we can proceed with external air traffic controllers. A big thank you go out to INVIRCAT and ANACNA, so air traffic controller organizations, being part of the advisory board, who came here from Italy, and that was a bit challenging to get that going during COVID times, but we had a good concept and it went very well. So one more pops up from Giovanni. Does loiter area that you designed fixed with, is the loiter area that you designed fixed with waypoints? For the turn rate, did you consider specific performances of RPAS? Are they flyable for different kinds of RPAS? So I think I can answer that. In our case, we have the simulation, the air traffic simulation as is, and with that, there are certain performance parameters. As I also said, it were Dornier 228 and Boeing 737. And for our simulation, we used BEDA, base of aircraft data from Eurocontrol. So a set of formula describing the behavior of an aircraft given a set of parameters. And the next step, so you have the beta data, and then you have the flight planning tool that you use, and that again depends on how airways are represented. In our case, it is, as you said, it is fixed by waypoints. So each corner carries one waypoint, and each waypoint in the corner is designed to be a flyby waypoint with a certain turn radius. And this turn radius is dependent on the aircraft that is simulated. So it looks different at a Dornier 228 compared to a Boeing 737. So if a Boeing 737 and a Dornier 228 enter the same loiter area at different altitudes or well separated, the resulting flight path would look a bit different. So I think when something like this is implemented, you could think of an area that can be used for the loitering and you will have to comply to certain behavior, but the loiter pattern or the flight path that your RPAS then takes will most probably, of course, be dependent on the airframe that you use and what it is capable of doing. So there has to be quite some work to be done to have loiter areas available for more than one RPA, so separation by altitude layers, and then taking into account different speeds. So if you want to use the same altitude layer, you would have to have a similar speed, for example, and then enter this loiter area well separated. And then, of course, detect and avoid systems in place so that this has a second layer of safety. Then again, we hope that this must not be used or does not have to be used for regular operations too much. So I wouldn't assume to have 10 RPAS enter the loiter area at all times. So this is assumed to be a fallback solution in case something happens. But great question, and there is different behavior of RPAS to be expected, and you will have to take care of that. I hope that answers this question. And we have one more, and it's still in our time frame, so I will take that. And Oliver asks a lost link example. Change into a C2 state can be configured in a current HAIL type, so high altitude, long endurance type RPA. This means it will be set according to the type of airspace which the RPA flies in, e.g., for example, it might vary between 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Change into a C2 state, lost link example. This is probably, if I understand you correctly, Oliver, this is probably a more elaborated answer to one of the earlier questions by Olivia, when the C2 link is reported as lost, and there are, or it is dependent on the airspace it is in and what RPA it is. So 30 seconds to 2 minutes is a number that you know is used. I hope I understood that correctly, that comment. My first feeling is that 30 seconds to 2 minutes in our case, while being in an arrival phase during an approach to the destination airport, would be too long. So if the remote pilot says, stand by, I'm waiting for my C2 link, and he says that for 2 minutes, I think that's quite a number in, well, at least at most airports that have quite a throughput. So I would assume in this case, the number should be lower when this procedure would be activated. All right, but thanks for the example and the elaboration on that. I don't see anything else.
Yeah.
Please, thank you so much.
I think that's time to pass over to Jürgen to get some impressions of the NLR simulation itself. So let's see.
Thank you, Niels and Gunnar.
There you go.
All right. Let me see if I can somehow get my presentation here. I hope that you can see it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. My name is Jürgen Teutsch. I'm responsible in this project for the validation activities at NLR. And I prepared this presentation together with my colleague, Co Peterson. He's somewhere in the background. I didn't see him in the list of panelists, so hopefully he will be able to talk if there are some gaps in my mind. But well, we'll see how it goes. I'll walk you through this presentation, and it's going to be a long walk. And if I considered it correctly, then I have maybe 30 seconds per slide, but I have a lot of pictures, so that isn't bad. There is a lot of text in some of the slides, and I probably do not linger on all of the slides for a very long time. But I thought that the information that is provided in the slides may be also important for you later to have it if we distribute these slides. So I'm going to focus on the really important things in the slides, and then continue. And if you have any more questions, of course, you can ask them in the chat afterwards. So the NLR simulations, as you have heard earlier in the presentation of Gabriela, had a specific focus. We also did simulations with a reference situation and nominal operation of RPAS. But then we had a specific focus on latency and contingency. And if I'm talking about contingencies, I mean that the RT was not working. So while DLR looked more at the C2 link not working, we focused on the radio communication. Then we also had conflict situations in our airspace, and on one of the days we also focused on the handover procedure from one ground station to the next. As Gunnar already announced, more or less, sorry, I lost my screen. We had different architectures that we looked at, and depending on the architecture, we had different values for the latency in C2 and radio communication. So what we call the RLOS latency was a situation where we had the RT via the RPAS or VHF link, and the C2 via VHF, and we had latencies of 290 milliseconds for the RT, and for the C2 link, sorry, I lost my screen again. I have to get rid of this. For the C2, we had 1 second. In the BRLOS situation, so beyond radio line of sight, we assumed that we'll have a satellite connection to the RPAS, and well, that was true for both the RT and the C2, and we assumed that we would have a latency of 700 milliseconds for the RT and 2 seconds for the C2 link. And oh, something went wrong. And then we had the ground-ground connection, where we assumed that the RT, the radio communication, would be established via a ground connection, which is obviously a bit faster. And the C2 would also go via the ground and then through the VHF. So that meant that we would have, well, the shortest delay for the radio communication of 150 milliseconds, but the C2 link, because you have additional ground delay, would amount to a latency of 1.5 seconds. So we also had a number of assumptions for our simulations. So the RPAS obviously flies as an IFR flight. It has a two-way communication with ATC, must remain separated from the traffic. So that is essentially, these are also the assumptions that we talked with the air traffic controllers and the pilots about. The RPAS files a flight plan. It has a fixed wing structure, and the more important ones, cameras cannot be used for flight critical situations. So for landing and takeoff, we did not consider the use of cameras, and the RPAS do not fly VFR patterns. well, that is already assumed in the first assumption where we say it flies an IFR, flies like an IFR flight. This is the vehicle that we considered. The pilots that we had were from the Dutch military. They were very much familiar with this vehicle, so this is also one of the reasons why we chose it. For the model that we used, we actually used, well, BADA model performance. That is what Gunnar already told you. We used to have a much more detailed model, which we used together with the maker of this vehicle, but we were obviously not allowed to use that model. So our model was based on generally publicly known performance parameters of the Reaper. So our simulation environment, I'll have a few pictures here. The NARSIM radar we used for the approach controller position. So, well, NARSIM, as you might know, is a real-time air traffic control simulator that we use for training and research. And well, in this case, we simulated the approach position of the airport that we considered. So it's a simulator with the human in the loop, and if we wanted to, we could have 8 to 12 fully equipped controller working positions. But well, for the purpose of this simulation, we only used one, obviously. Then we have the NARSIM tower simulator, which is in a separate room because it's rather large. It has a diameter of 11 meters, and the walls are some 4.5 meters high. 9 working positions there, but obviously the airport that we simulated is a bit smaller. And we didn't use Amsterdam Schiphol, which has these 9 positions, but a small airport. And so we just had one of these positions that we used. And as a simulation unit for our remotely piloted aircraft, we used the multi-UAV simulation testbed, which is a reconfigurable generic UAS research simulation facility here at NLR. And well, it served as our ground control station for the Reaper. The environment, well, this is a schematic display of it. So, well, the pictures on the right show you the approach position, and then the tower controller position, and finally the ground control station for the Reaper. And in the schematic on the left, you see how it works. It's basically our NARSIM simulator that has some plug and play functionality for the working positions that you would like to add. So you add one radar position and you add one tower controller working position, and you have a simulation setup together with 2 pseudo pilots, and that had to be connected to the ground control station of the RPAS, and we did this through a dislink. Then of course, yeah, well, I didn't tell you about this. This gives a picture of our standard pseudo pilot stations. So we had these 2 pseudo pilots who took over the rest of the IFR traffic that we had. And this is our environment. So we had Rotterdam The Hague Airport as our well, airport environment. It had an average number of about well, 1 to 2 million passengers and about 50,000 movements a year in the years before 2019. So we thought that that would be an appropriate airport. It's in the Netherlands. It's one of the larger airports behind Schiphol, and it's in a larger metropolitan area, so it's rather significant. But also it enabled us to see the direct impact that the RPAS operations have on the regular traffic. It shows it much more, well, in a more direct way than if you would introduce such an operation at a large hub such as Schiphol. We used that airport in a configuration with southwesterly wind, so we used runway 24. And here you can see we used that regular runway 24 ILS approach as the basis for our IFR approaches. We had some VFR traffic in between, and that was well considered as well. So the air traffic controller, they had to integrate that VFR traffic into the landing sequence. These were our scenarios. There were quite a lot since we were looking at several areas. So we needed a reference scenario where we only looked at manned traffic. So that was a simple NARSIM simulation, so to speak, without any RPAS involved. Then we had the nominal scenarios in which we considered all flight phases, so departure and all arrival phases up to the landing. Where we had simulations with one RPAS only, which was our must RPAS, and is the high fidelity model that we used. But we also had a nominal situation just for comparison with multiple RPAS that were then simulated in NARSIM, which has a bit of a lower fidelity model in use, still based on the beta data that we had. Then we had the contingency scenarios also in all different flight phases. And contingency, as I told you, means RT failure. What we did was we split parts of the scenarios for the loiter case, as we didn't want to have unnecessary effort in having to perform a loiter operation and integration of the RPAS again into a landing sequence 10 different times. It would have led to the same results more or less in our traffic scenarios. So we kept that apart. So most of the contingency situations at arrival were carried out up to the loiter point, and then we stopped it. And then at a later point, we performed scenarios in which we started from the loitering and tried to get the RPAS into the landing sequence. Then we also had scenarios which were very much like the nominal scenarios we had before. The latency scenarios, well, of course, we set the different parameters that I introduced earlier. And well, in all the flight phases, we looked whether there was an impact on air traffic controller or pilots. We also had conflict scenarios where we introduced the conflict during departure and arrival phases. And finally, we had handover scenarios with 3 different options for air-ground communications, just to see what is the most appropriate one for a handover that has to take place in the TMA. So I'm going quickly through these pictures that show you the different scenarios, the SIDs and the stars, and the routes that we used in the different scenarios. So just know that we had diverse traffic in the reference on most SIDs and stars for that direction 24. For the nominal and latency scenarios, which I said were kind of comparable, we had a departure of our must RPAS on the Costa 1B SID, and we used a specific star for all the arrival operations of the mast. You see both here. So for the contingency scenarios, what was very interesting was that, as I told you before, we had that loiter situation that we didn't want to repeat. So in order to assess this in all the different flight phases that we had one situation in which we did a departure contingency, and we fully played this contingency with the assumption that RT would be restored after the loitering. But the case in which it would not be restored, that was a separate loiter scenario that we had. And in the same way, we had a BR loss arrival scenario that was executed fully, and parts of it were also kind of a repetition. So we all the other arrival scenarios that we had, they stopped at the loiter point, and we had then the dedicated scenario that would start from the loiter point. So when RT failed, the general idea was that the remote pilot will contact ATC via backup telephone line. And there were separate backup lines for tower and approach, so different phone numbers, more or less, you could say. And the RPAS label was then highlighted on the controller working position when the remote pilot selects a specific squawk. And then the RPAS was guided to the loiter point and was geographically separated from the other flows. And if the failure continues, then we used the backup line to guide the aircraft from the loiter to the arrival sequence. And if it was restored, we simply continued the previous operation according to the flight plan. And here you see some of the scenarios. So we more or less indicated to the pilot when the contingency should occur. And you see that specific loiter point we had there in the north of Rotterdam, close to Delft, in that area where we thought that that the loitering in that area would have the minimum impact on the rest of the operation. And also in the arrival cases, you see several here. There would have been several options for the pilot to go to that loiter point, and then eventually from the loiter point get back into the arrival sequence. As I said, we had separate loiter scenarios. Then what happened in the loiter was essentially that the RPAS would loiter in a clockwise direction, and either the RT issue was resolved then or it was not resolved. If it was resolved, then the ATCO was contacted, the squawk was changed back, and the pilot followed the approach again. If it was not resolved after 4 loiter patterns, then we would use the backup telephone line. We didn't look at cases, by the way, where the backup telephone line was not working. We also had some phraseology as a suggestion, and in the end asked controllers and pilots if these were appropriate. I have, hopefully, a small movie for you. For that, I need to go back to this screen, and let me see if I can find it. This movie, I have to say, it's going to show you one of these contingency scenarios. This is why I have it here. It's also in the middle of the presentation, so that's convenient. So it shows you a departure situation where we have an RT loss, and the pilot he will, the pilot, he will then contact first the tower controller on the backup line. This is because the pilot, well, is still under the assumption that he's controlled by the tower controller. The tower controller sees that the flight has proceeded further and is now under control, actually, of the approach controller. So he will coordinate with the approach controller that that there is an RT loss, and the approach controller will handle it from there. So you see all these communication situations coming along in the video. So let me see if I can find it. And hopefully you'll have some sound. The tower control here. All right, so I hope this gave you a good impression of what we did during our simulations. That was for the contingency, the RT contingency in the departure phase. So I have to get back to my presentation, hopefully. Let me see. Hopefully you can see it now. I hope you can see it.
Yes, confirmed.
All right, thank you. So we continue. We also had conflict scenarios. So we had a conflict in the departure phase where we considered that if the conflict occurs, the RPA would be taken from the SID, and well, when the situation would be over, then well, there would be instructions to continue back to the SID. And in the arrival phase, we also assumed that as soon as the conflict occurred, the RPA would be vectored somewhere, so essentially out of the way, or put in a holding. And when the conflict is over, would continue on the star on the standard arrival pattern. So for this reason, we had a conflict, and we did this, by the way, in a BR loss situation where we would have some latency to see if that has an impact. There would simply be an aircraft behind that was released too early and would be too fast and would catch in on the RPA, and there would be a conflict on that SID. Similarly, in the arrival situation, also in beyond radio line of sight, there's an aircraft following on the same star, and it gets too close to our RPA, which performance-wise, by the way, was a bit different from the rest of the traffic. So it was a bit slower. It may be comparable to VFR, but then again a bit faster than VFR. But for the regular IFR traffic, it somehow was, of course, in the way. So it had to be coordinated very well, actually, if you consider the whole ATC chain. But we simply assumed in the case of the conflict that a faster aircraft would be released too early from a previous sector and will catch in on the RPA, which is a slower aircraft. Finally, the handover. So we performed a handover in the TMA, and that meant that we chose a specific point in the departure that could be used to carry out a certain handover procedure. We had defined 3 different procedures for that, and they all took place at the same point called INVIR. And we wanted to see what the controller had to say about it, and if it fit with his idea of controlling traffic on that departure SID. So the first one was a handover during a dedicated loiter maneuver. So the aircraft would fly towards the INVIR point, would loiter there for some time, and then perform the handover. One was carried out simply on the last SID segment, the last point of the SID, more or less, with active ATC involvement. So a pilot would sign out and sign in again. And the final was without ATC involvement. And this was the location of INVIR. You can see it here. It was the point on the last segment of the SID, just before the last point, INVIRCAT. So the handover scenario 1, to look at it in more detail, the RPAS entered the loiter maneuver, and the pilot would declare a handover procedure. Then we would have, this would take place for about 2 minutes. Transfer would be controlled according to a specific procedure, and then the second pilot declares success of the procedure and requests a clearance to continue. The second scenario, more or less the same. Again, the procedure is declared, and after about 2 minutes, the second pilot will come up again and declare success of the procedure, and will continue on the SID. And finally, we had a situation where, the RPA simply passed that point that I indicated, and both of the pilots would monitor ATC, and the pilot in command would then be required to react to the commands of a controller should they be given anywhere close to that point. And so it's kind of a silent coordination then, as a silent handover, and the second pilot would simply continue on the SID and continue with the flight. We also had the procedure written out, but that proved to be not necessary, because our military pilots that we had, they already have such a procedure, and they could give us some insight in what actually happens there in the cockpit, and what needs, in the cockpit, on the ground station, and what needs to be done when they have such a handover procedure from one pilot to the next. For our simulations, well, we had some training, of course, that we prepared. That training helped the ATCOs to get familiar with the environment in general and the idea that we had about the RPAs, the different scenarios. And of course, the pilots were also trained on the MUST, but they were military pilots. They were already very much familiar with the vehicle, so that was easy for us. This is our program then. So as you can see, we had the training in the beginning and then all the different runs that I described to you earlier. As you can see, we had the handover on the handover scenarios on a specific day. What we also had there is a scenario called latency 4. I didn't talk to you about this yet. This was a scenario that we added because we found actually that some of the delays that we have either in the C2 link or in the communication were not really having an impact on any of the controllers' work or the pilot's work. So with that final run, we increased values drastically by a factor of 2, just to see how the controller and the pilots would react and if it indeed would have an impact on their operation then. As measurements, we had obviously we had a participant information sheet for all our participants before they started the work. Further, we gathered simulator data and we had questionnaires. We had some specific questionnaires that we always use at NLR to assess also the experience on our simulator, but we also had, of course, the questionnaires that we used across the different simulation platforms, which were post-run questionnaires, post-experiment questionnaires, and we did that daily just to see if there were differences between different days of the simulation campaign. And we had questions for the final day as well. Few impressions again. So you see here the MUST station, our ground control station. The outside view above wasn't really used, as I said before, so we switched that off. But well, the pilot still had his controls there on also the control screen on the right that could be used as an alternative, and his map view there in the middle. And there was a simulation engineer watching what was going on in the control station. Here, the NARSIM approach controller position with the approach control for Rotterdam and the top controller in a Rotterdam environment. And our pseudo pilots and the making of the movie. So this is how it all looked like. Now I have some preliminary results. The results concern, well, some general comments we had, the latency issues, the contingency scenarios, the conflict scenarios, and the handover. Again, I have to say it's very much preliminary, so this is based on briefing material and some of the questionnaires, but we haven't fully assessed the questionnaires yet. So maybe eventually we'll notice something out of the ordinary that isn't in these slides yet. But for now, the ATCO feedback generally was that the RPAS performance was well, close to that of a general aviation aircraft. So more the VHF side of aircraft than the IFR. And the advantage was that the Rotterdam controllers are used to that kind of traffic, which adds to the general IFR traffic. So if there would have been larger differences, probably there would have been larger challenges for them. But still, they said having that slower traffic on the SIDS and stars and not on VFR routes was a challenge. The traffic at Rotterdam was considered similar to real operations. Well, a bit more traffic than what you would see throughout the day, but they considered it a peak of IFR movements for the day. So the simulation runs, they also lasted between half an hour and sometimes 45 minutes, but usually half an hour. And well, it was a good mix of IFR and VFR traffic. For the latency, as I said, it wasn't really considered to be an issue. So slow pilot reactions were not uncommon to controllers. And they said that the latency may have been more noticeable when the radio bandwidth is in full use. This was already busy for Rotterdam, but well, for that airspace, it really didn't present a challenge for them. Maybe in busier airspace where you're on the frequency all the time, it would have been more noticeable. They also did not apply different buffers between manned and unmanned aircraft. That is an observation that we had. So that supports the idea that DLR also had that there is some equity in there. So the controllers do not look at the different types of traffic differently when adding safety buffers. In our simulation, they could see the difference between the different type of traffic. At Rotterdam, on the radar approach display, they have a different indicator for the blip. It's a normal blip for the IFR traffic, and it's a V for VHF traffic, and an R for the RPA. So they could see the difference, but they didn't really apply different buffers. They considered slower speeds at approach when building a sequence. Yeah, that of course they did, because, well, essentially they would have to see whether the RPA would fit nicely into the sequence, or if they would have to change the order of the sequence because there was faster traffic behind. For the contingency, RT failure, that is very interesting, was less of a safety issue than in manned aviation due to an available backup phone. Yeah, because there is that backup phone on the ground, it's not as bad, and it's not considered to be that bad because you expect that someone will pick up the phone if anything goes wrong. So using a loiter point, which is the normal procedure if you have a C2 failure, for the RT failure was not required according to the ATCOs. Instead, unmanned aircraft should be treated the same as manned aircraft, something that DLR also said would come from their simulations. And well, they would follow the same rules for RT loss, so follow the last clearance and continue according to the flight plan, or if close to the landing, initiate a missed approach if necessary. Well, of course, if the backup communication was not working during the arrival, this is also not a terrible situation, because the aircraft can then be guided towards the runway using the backup communication means. And well, if even that backup communication fails, then you could still apply the same procedure that is used for RT loss with manned aircraft, which is the missed approach procedure, and then you follow that back to the holding. That is standard procedure there at Rotterdam Airport. Suggestions, because that backup communication was used quite frequently in our simulations, of course, the ATCOs had the suggestion that these specific channels should be integrated in the controller working position. Now, for the sake of our simulations, we use simple IP phones. So yeah, that well, if in a future situation where you have a number of remote pilot stations that frequently fly to this airport, these communication channels could be added. But even better, you could have some kind of dedicated line for that, together with a chat function. And our military pilots told us that this is what usually is the case when they're flying the RPA. They have that dedicated phone and chat function that they can use in case there are connection issues. Yeah, and finally, of course, one of the suggestions, the backup communication has to be a secure connection. One of the observations, so the approach controller gave a clearance for landing in coordination with the tower to prevent the loss of communication on the backup line while transferring the RPIL. Such coordinations happen, of course, and the ATCOs told us that the reasons are that in that case they wouldn't want the risk of losing the backup line, so they coordinate a lot via their intercom to well make these things happen if these contingencies happen in a very critical situation. And well, the ATCO would also contact the remote pilot if they saw a nice gap from the loiter to land the RPA. So that was also some service that were given more or less. Then for the conflict scenario, well, the TCAS onboard manned aircraft that covers the vertical plane, and the DAA onboard the RPAS, which we really didn't consider in our simulations, but still in the horizontal plane, would prevent major conflict. So if the RPAS would not respond or would be slow to respond, the TCAS would always help. So that was their feedback on a conflict situation. So even if in these conflict situations where we had beyond radio line of sight latencies, then this would probably not be a major issue. The latency was not noticed. Again, I have to say, in many of the scenarios, they didn't even know they had a larger latency. The 700 milliseconds were simply not enough, well, to make that noticeable. And for the C2, well, there's a slow response, but they don't really notice any latency as controllers in the C2 link. The pilot would, but well, even for the pilot, it didn't present a real problem. What they said though was that they felt a little more uncomfortable when working with unmanned aircraft if no immediate action was taken, but that is something that is well that they use to when working with slow reacting pilots. And as suggestions, so when determining the minimum separation of manned aircraft, the response time was considered. So indeed, they looked at, well, how long does it take till somebody responds? But that was well, they didn't make a difference between manned or unmanned. It's simply something that's in their mind, as they said. If they see that something reacts more slowly, then they will adapt to that. Well, it must also be ensured that the latency within the TMA is as small as possible. Yeah, that is maybe one of the results that we have. So BR loss, even though it didn't really have a large impact here, but it may have an impact on the operations in the TMA. So obviously the latencies should be as small as possible in the TMA, because a lot of operations are going on there. Finally, the handover. So it was considered technically feasible. Generally, it was stated that they would want to have it at a later stage. The TMA is maybe not the most appropriate part of your flight operation where you would want to perform such a handover, as well, simply performing a loiter maneuver there, or such a coordination that takes 2 minutes at a certain waypoint that congests your operation perhaps in the TMA. So if you would carry it out, you would probably carry it out a bit later when having left the TMA. Also, it was more or less undesired to have the traffic fly past a loitering point and perform the handover there, because the RPAS response is delayed due to the handover action. So indeed that is again the same comment we have above, that there would be some time they would have to reserve for that, and in that time they cannot have any other traffic in that area. And the handover may be performed along the SIT when the ATCO is notified about the exact location and the duration of the silence. So they must be informed very early on that this is going to happen on the SIT, so they can, well, consider that when controlling the other traffic in the TMA that is perhaps in approach and that might be impacted by such an operation. And of course, it must be made sure that communication is never lost during the handover. And one of the suggestions they had was that if the handover is taking more time and the last cleared waypoint has been reached, the RPAS can loiter at that waypoint. And the pilots provided and used their own handover communication procedure. That was also something that we gained from this. So it's slightly suggested from the procedure we deviated from the procedure we suggested, but nevertheless we obtained a good impression of what kind of systems they check and what kind of communication is going on between the pilots. So that was very valuable. And as an observation, it should be known for the air traffic controller who is the RPIL in control. Yeah, in the last scenario, as you have seen, it is not clear because it's a silent handover, and well, if that takes 2 minutes, the controller doesn't know who to talk to. Well, who should he talk to in case of an RT failure? Who should he call? So that is something that would have to be considered for such a scenario, and that obviously wouldn't be the best scenario to use in that occasion. So that was my presentation. It was a bit lengthy. I hope not too long. I think I used my slot of 40 minutes, and we now have 20 minutes of questions left, if I'm correct, or maybe I've been too long already.
Unfortunately not, although Co is already ready for answering questions. If you agree, I would propose to stick to the agenda as good as possible and make the break now, and maybe keep your questions in case there are any for the questions and answer round at the end. Do you agree? Can you live with that?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you for the presentation, Jürgen, and Co for your work on that as well, and for you agreeing to that we stick to the plan. I would think it's 11:17. That's close enough. So we meet again at 11:30, and stay tuned for the CIRA contribution for the RTS simulation report. And yeah, talk to you soon.
Bye.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. And welcome to the second part of the INVIRCAT Open Day. So far, we learned about the validation objectives and already the simulation campaign at DLR and NLR. And now still to follow is the third part of the simulation exercises hosted at CIRA. And Ricardo will give us some insight on the setting and how it went and how it looked like. So I'm looking forward to that. We can then proceed to the final discussion phase probably. And if you have any questions, either for the whole project or on one of the simulation exercises or the validation approach, whatever comes to your mind that is not clear, please feel free to state that or raise your hand and we can enable you to speak with us as well. So either use the questions box or raise your hand. And with that, I will give the floor to Ricardo. Thanks.
Thank you, Gunnar. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, confirmed, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So, good morning. I'm Riccardo Rocchio from CIRA, and I will introduce you the third part of the real-time simulation we got for the INVIRCAT project, and more specifically the one we had at CIRA. So the CIRA simulation, real-time simulation campaign was held for 5 full days between the 9th and the 17th of December of 2021, so a bit later than the others, then as you could see in the last two presentations. As also Gabriella said at the beginning, so in the introduction of these three presentations, at CIRA we focus mainly on the ATOL operations, both in nominal and contingency situation, but always considering some key aspects for the introduction of RPAS that are, let's say, some peculiar characteristic of the RPAS as the C2-link latency and the C2-link fail. So let's start with introducing a bit the validation facility we use at CIRA to perform this real-time simulation. So this is the ESF, that is actually the integrated simulation facility that we have at CIRA, at our lab. And this is a real-time hardware and human-in-the-loop distributed integrated simulation facility that we have been developing, and we used in the past, and we are going to use also in the future for some different research activities. And for each research activity, we update a bit the simulation to always have the new functionality, let's say. So the main components we used in this simulation campaign was the real-time, the RPAS high fidelity simulator, that is Flare Sim, the controller working position prototype that you can see here, and also the scenario simulator with its pseudopilot human machine interface that we are going to, all the three we are going to see a bit more in detail in the next slide. So let's start with the Flare Sim. So that FlareSim implements a 6 degree of freedom dynamic model of a fixed wind light RPIS with approximately 550 kilograms of maximum takeoff weight and 90 knots of maximum speed. This actually implements the model of the Tecnam P92 that you can see in the small picture on the ground control station here on the left. We use this aircraft, this Tecnam P92. We modified this aircraft to be used as an RPAS, and we use this in different research activities. In the picture on the left, you can see the ground control station. That is the exact replica of the one we used in the to actually fly the probe RPIS. And FlareSim actually got the same flight control computer as the real aircraft, with the same GNC that got standard functionality, and the one that we mostly use in the simulation campaign is the ATOL capability. So in the picture on the right, you can see the out of windows view that the remote pilot was able to see, but as also in the NLR presentation, the remote pilot and the ATOL in general couldn't rely on the visual information as assumption in our simulation, and also the human-machine interface used from the remote pilots to control the RPA and to monitor its status. So in the picture you can see, for example, I don't know if it's actually noticeable, a red LED on, that is actually an ATOL failure that we were simulating at the time the picture was taken. So at second element, so simulator, let's say, that we use in our simulation campaign, there is the controller working position, that is an emulator of an air traffic controller working position with a customized HMI prototype that was developed in-house with the support of professional air traffic controller operator. This HMI implements advanced functionalities to help the controller to manage both manned and RPAS traffic. So in these two pictures, on the left and on the bottom of the right, you can see that all of the traffic is actually differentiated by means of a color code, let's say. So the white traffic, the traffic indicated in white, is a manned traffic that is taken in control by the tower controller in this case, while the RPAS is indicated, is differentiated actually by channel call sign. And also in the right, the picture on the bottom of the right part of the slide, you can see the representation of a C2-link fail. So in this case, the controller working position would show to the control operator the call sign in red, and the squawk code 7400 would appear in red and blinking to notice, to give the information to the controller of the C2-link fail. So finally, the final part of the facility we used in the INVIRCAT campaign is the scenario simulator and the pseudopilot HMI. So the scenario simulator is the environment for the management of all the ISF facility scenario agents data. It includes different functionalities like the traffic simulator, but also the weather condition simulator and no-flight zone generator. For the, as I stated before, so for the INVIRCAT campaign, we mostly use the traffic simulator that allow to add and control traffic in the simulated scenario. So traffic, it's actually pre-generated by specifying some constraint for the traffic itself. So in this case, we specified the traffic density, for example, and the typology of aircraft to be included into the traffic. And during the real-time simulation, the pseudo-pilots can control each of the generated traffic by means of custom-made HMI that allowed him to follow the instruction of the traffic controller. So, but let's get a bit deeper in the real-time simulation campaign. So at CIRA, we covered the operation in final approach and landing until the RPI stops on the runway, and takeoff and initial climb from holding on runway. So we consider two different levels of C2 link latency. So we simulated the low latency of 0.5 seconds as round trip, and the high C2 link latency that was of 2 second round trip. So round tripping means that information get 2 seconds, for example, in the high latency, to go from the ground control station to the RPA and back to the ground control station. As also for the DLR simulation, we didn't simulate different level of voice link latency. So we assumed the ground-ground connection that allow a low latency voice link between the remote pilots and the air traffic controller. So in our campaign, we considered 3 different contingencies that were simulated. We got the ATOL failure that is it was actually not the impossibilitation to continue with the operation, because we also considered the ATOL fail operational, but we will in the next slide better understand what was the procedure for the when this kind of contingency happens. And we simulated the runway incursion to actually simulate complex situation. And we also consider as contingency the C2 link fail for a total of different traffic scenarios. So to go a bit deeper in this contingency situation, we actually the actual procedure that was followed after another failure happened or rise during the takeoff was differentiated by means of the velocity of the remote of the RPA. So if an ATOL failure rise before V1, the ATOL would automatically perform a rejected takeoff, while if the ATOL failure happens during after V1 but before VR, the rotation velocity, the RPIL will get informed through the HMI and may command a rejected takeoff. The same for the if the ATOL failure rise during the landing phase. So, but here the differentiation would be done by means of the height of the vehicle. So if the failure happens before or above alert height, the ATOL would automatically perform a missed approach ground procedure. While if the failure rise below alert height but above the decision point, the RPIL would get informed through the HMI and may command a missed approach go around. That would be executed by the ATOL itself. So another point that differentiates our simulation to the DLR and NLR ones is the C2 link fail. As I said before, we simulated the operation from the final approach fix, so in the final approach only. So to assess the exchange of information between the controller and the pilots during a C2 link fail, we actually change a bit the procedure and consider that if a CIRA fail happens after the fixed approach, the final approach fix point, the ATOL actually keep following the landing procedure, waiting for the return of the link until the missed approach point, and after that point, the ATOL automatically perform a missed approach go around. So this is a procedure that is different from what actually happened in the DLR and NLR simulation, and it's let's say a bit it was made on purpose only to assess, so as I said before, the information exchange between the RPIL and the traffic controller. And finally, as we said, for the conflict, to assess conflict situation, we simulated runway incursion that could happen during while the RPIS was in landing phase or in takeoff phase. And when a runway incursion occur, the controller may command to the RPIS a rejected takeoff or a missed approach go around. The simulation scenario in which the CIRA campaign was held is the Bari airport, and here we can see the start procedure and also the vertical phases and the missed approach pattern. The runway that was taken in consideration for the operation was the 07, that was so pointing to the sea, and the elevation of the runway for this runway was 193 feet, and the intercept altitude, as we can also see from the lower figures, is 3,000 feet. The traffic flow that we actually generated through the traffic simulator was of 20 operation hour. So the key assumption we had in our campaign was actually took in consideration the fact that we as core focus the ATOL operation. So we assume that the RPAS shall have an ATOL capability that is able to operate autonomously in case of a CIRA fail, or in general in a situation in which the remote pilot is not able to control directly the vehicle, and that the ATOL can perform operation during takeoff, initial climb, approach landing, and missed approach, so in both nominal and some contingency situation. But also that in these phases, the ATOL should fly the RPA as in an IFR flight. So now I will show you a video that will actually will bring you a bit in the idea of an open day. So we'll take you to the lab in the period we were experiencing the simulation. So we will actually see a nominal takeoff operation and a landing operation with an ATOL fail, and I will share the video. Here it is. Okay. So now that the video will start, you will see the CVP windows with the smaller windows on the top of left corner with the HMI. So you will see what the controller saw during the simulation but also at the same time what the remote pilot saw. And you will also listen to the communication they had during the simulation. So it will last like 5 minutes. So I will stop perhaps and to highlight some more phases, some what happens in the different phases, but I will not talk during the video as the audio will represent what they were talking to each other.
And Tower India, Charlie India, Romeo Alpha at the holding point 07, ready for departure.
Are you ready for an immediate takeoff?
Ready for an immediate takeoff, Charlie India, Romeo Alpha.
Roger. Clear line up and takeoff, wind calm.
Clear to line up and take off, India, Romeo Alpha.
Bari Tower Lima Whiskey Golf 101 outer mark.
So I stopped the video. As you can see now, another Windows pop-up on the top right corner. Here you can see the remote pilots that is actually activating the automatic takeoff operation and is looking at HMI to get all the information from the RPA, looking for eventually to an idle failure to manually command the rejected takeoff in case he thinks it's needed.
Roger, sir, you are number 1.
Roger. Can I proceed to
India, Romeo Alpha rolling.
Romeo Alpha, Roger. 101, affirmative. You are number 1.
Roger, number 1.
One zero one, you are clear to land, wind calm.
101, clear to land, wind calm.
India Romeo Alpha Airborne 55, you may switch approach 136.1.
With approach 1361, India, Romeo Alpha. Bye-bye.
Have a nice day, bye.
So, and now in the second part of the video, we are going to see a landing phase with an idle failure. The video was actually edited to show some highlights of the simulation. So we will see 3 different small section with the main communication made between remote pilot and the controller.
Bari Torre, buongiorno, India, Charlie India, Romeo Alpha, release from approach, on course to Bravo Alpha India, 3000 feet.
India, Charlie India, Romeo Alpha, Bari Tower, buongiorno. You are number 1, present Bari weather, visibility 7 kilometers, sky clear, altimeter 1018, running news 07, wind calm. Report leaving Bravo Alpha India for LS approach.
Roger will report leaving Bravo Alpha India and copy the weather in Bravo India, Romeo Alpha.
Swissair 171 Golf on the ground 45, report runway vacated.
171 Golf, Roger. And I call you when the runway located.
Catch.
India, Charlie, India, Romeo Alpha, leaving Bravo Alpha India.
India Romeo Alpha, Roger, report outer marker and field inside.
I will report the outer marker, India, Romeo Alpha.
Bari 171 Golf, runway located.
171 Golf, Roger, you may switch ground 12175.
12175 today, 171 Golf.
Have a nice day, sir, bye.
Bye-bye.
And Bari India Romeo Alpha just left the outer marker, gear down, field inside.
India Romeo Alpha, you are clear to land, wind calm.
Clear to land, India Romeo Alpha.
Maintain. Bari RPILs.
I stopped again the video. As you may said, in this last part of the video, in the top left part of where the HMI interface is shown, the Adolf failure rise, so in this, the altitude is actually below the alert high. So in this moment, actually, the pilot is getting the information of the Adolf failure and is actually commanding a missed approach go around. And as you will see, it will start the communication with the controller about this procedure.
Yankee Echo, other marker.
You are still number 2.
Bari Alitalia 1649er, next 3000 feet to Bravo Alpha India. LS approach 07.
1649er, Roger. Present Bari weather 7 kilometers, sky clear, altimeter 1018. Run use at 07, wind calm. Report leaving Bravo Alpha India.
We report Bravo Alpha India 1018.
And Bari India Romeo Alpha, due to an Adolf failure, is going around.
Roger, sir. Climb to 3,000 feet and please, if possible, expedite your climb until passing 1,500 feet.
Roger, climbing to 3,000, expediting India Romeo Alpha.
Rainer 39 Yankee Echo, you are clear to land, wind calm.
39 Yankee Echo, clear to land, wind calm.
India Charlie India Romeo Alpha, confirm request of missed approach holding pattern.
Say again for India Romeo Alpha.
Confirm your intention to fly inbound holding pattern Osmal.
That's affirmative for a few minutes, and then we'll request the reader vectors.
Roger, sir. Climb to 3,000 and fly inbound holding pattern Osmal.
Roger, flying to holding pattern Osmal, India Romeo Alpha.
Okay. So now you should see the presentation again. So this was a bit of what we actually did in the last December for these 5 days of simulation campaign. So as we were the last in our in the INVIRCAT group to make simulation, we didn't have that much preliminary result. So from the collecting of the questionnaire, we made that the controller and the pilot, we could give you some small preliminary results. So from what it seems from this questionnaire, controller and remote pilots expresses positively on acceptability and safety for the introduction of RPIS in TMA, both in nominal and in contingency situation. Probably because of the procedure we actually asked them to perform during the C2Link fail, there were still some concern regarding the C2Link fail procedure, but actually the concern was about if to consider the C2Link fail as a contingency or an emergency, and specifically the controller at the beginning thought that the C2Link should be considered as emergency, so that all the traffic should be stopped and should be resolve the contingency before the normal operation could happen, but getting some confidence with the atoll system, and the fact that is actually our third preliminary result, that the atoll actually flies the RPIS as a manned IFR, so that there are not that much of difference between an RPAS and a manned vehicle. They start thinking that perhaps also a contingency with a proper procedure that would need surely more in-depth studies could be okay for the C2Link fail operation. And that's all for my presentation. So if you have some question, I can reply to you. So at the moment, I cannot see any question from the chat box.
Yes, Riccardo, I confirm that there are no questions written.
Okay, so perhaps if we waiting, we can also recover a bit of the question and answer of NLR, if in the meantime somebody has some question.
Okay, no questions so far, it seems. Thank you, Riccardo, for the insight.
Okay,
it was very good to see that in action. And the air traffic controller remained very calm when the atoll failed, so that was impressive to me.
Yeah, they actually, as I said in the first conclusion, it's actually they say that missed approach go around actually happens all the time, also with manned aircraft, so that the contingency that actually require a missed approach go around procedure didn't change the fact that of what it's actually happened. So for them, they cannot see any difference in the RPAS and the manned vehicle, apart of course from the C2Link failure, and also for the latency, as you said, for the DLR simulation and also the NLR, they didn't notice any peculiar, let's say, behavior, because they stated that also normal manned traffic could have quite of a latency depending on the reaction time of the pilots and or the dynamic of the vehicle.
Yeah, that is quite a takeaway, I would think, from our simulations, that the real world with manned aircraft is not ideal. So if we compare it to an ideal simulation with instantaneous reaction of the aircraft, there might be a slight difference, at least. And that is one feedback that our pseudo-pilots for manned aircraft also received in previous simulation activities, that sometimes they are quite fast and sometimes a bit too fast by just typing in. I don't know the exact way of doing this, but I think if there is a heading change to heading 100, they type H, hotel for heading, and then 100, and it sometimes is quicker than someone like dialing in the cockpit or taking the stick and steering. Yeah, so it's a bit of a trade-off, and sometimes the effects are not that big as you would expect.
Yeah, actually, we got also feedback from one of the pilots that was also used to fly manned aircraft, and he said that sometimes they use also if they were able to execute the what the controller asked, they wait a bit, let's say, they will count like 1 second, before to give the actual command to the vehicle to avoid, I don't know, the unexpected behavior, or to, I don't know. It's a way of execute.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I don't know if any questions popped up on your side. If so, they are somehow assigned to you, and you should be able to see them in the questions box. But okay, then let's.
Sorry, Gunnar. Yes, we have a question. Great. I can read it for you so that we can be faster.
Okay.
The question is from Christian Wenzel, and the question is this one. The last CIRA simulation might also be adapted to UAM traffic scenarios. What would you consider as needed adoption in order to consider UAM? That's the question, or the comment.
Okay. Yeah, we actually didn't consider that. Let's say we had one of the point that as the INVIRCAT project actually focused on the IFR operation, we also get the feedback from SESAR that the use space and should be the focus, but as actually also Gabriela stated in the introduction presentation, we always got an eye on the use space, let's say, well, the possible connection between use space and TMA and the IFR traffic. But it's actually not the focus point of the INVIRCAT project, but it will surely be a really good, let's say, subject to study in the next future as the use space is getting a real thing, let's say. And surely Gunnar is, I think, is much more involved in this area.
I am a bit, that's true. So we are also investigating in other projects what is the required interface between ATM, traditional ATM, and use space, so unmanned traffic management. And it is quite a way to go, I would say, because the research on use space haven't finished. So the exact interfaces are still to come and to be defined. Again, it's a big part of research in the future and will be. And for your information, our take on the use space interfaces, or what can be used from use space, or what can be given to use space, can be found in our initial concept of operations. So on the public website, deliverable 2.3 has a dedicated section for use space related thoughts and findings and research. But thanks for the question. Yeah. Anything else? I do have some wrap-up slides. I would just put them on the screen so we can talk about what happened today. I hope you can see it, and then go to the questions and answers if there are any. So thank you all for your participation and presentations. I think it was a very good insight. And to recap, maybe the validation approach that we presented, or that Gabriela presented, when taken all together, so we split the simulations as we already stated, and when taking everything together, we covered all validation objectives and the scenario variables that we detailed in our planning documents. Then we think the concept of operations from our first feeling, let's say, it seems very good. We have to refine it a bit at certain places, but we think it's quite fitting for what it is intended to do. The quantitative analysis is still ongoing, so the throughput and delay numbers are investigated. Our feeling again from observing this and from collecting feedback from the air traffic controllers, as was also apparent in some of our presentations, the air traffic controllers did not feel that there is a major impact, and they were trying to integrate the RPAS as good as possible without having an impact on the overall operation. What else? We carefully detailed the data collection plan and how we managed to collect and write down things and assess it. So there is, even though we have split simulation activities, we have a good comparison available because it is the same way that we collected the data. And the feedback sessions, also in the debriefing sessions, we had the same questions we asked, and we expect so in red, so that we can have this as a good basis to have our final findings in the project. So we are very much looking forward to that. This is just a wrap up. I don't know if it's worth. I hope you remember what we at DLR did. So if you have any questions that came to your mind in the coffee break, feel free to put them in the chat box. We had the impact of latency in the C2 link and the procedures and phraseology for C2 link loss, and how the loiter areas were used and how it was displayed to the air traffic controller. And then these use cases of transponder failure and a forced conflict. And for the NLR activities, you saw a numerous number of simulation scenarios, and that was very well presented, and with a good video along with that, in nominal operations where RPAS performance was varied, and the latency on both radio and C2 link, and then contingency operations when the RT, so radio communication, is lost, and the handover operations that we detailed in 3 different ways and tried them out. And for CIRA, the last presentation by Ricardo, you saw focusing on the ATOL procedures and what happens if there is a contingency in the final mile shortly before touchdown, and then having to initiate a missed approach go around. So how does that impact the operations? And that hopefully concludes in very few words. So we have plenty of time. If you have any question, please put them in the box or raise your hand. And if there is already any question, I'm happy to hear that. Any additions from the presenters that you would like to highlight, or questions to the others? Maybe you have questions, we have questions for ourselves, I don't know. Nothing yet, so we'll give the participants some more minutes, I would say, to formulate if they have something. I don't know if I'm able to see all questions, so if I'm missing something, please let me know from the organization point of view.
No, there are no other questions at the moment.
Okay, fine. That is a good sign for us. So we were clear. In case you have any questions, you can see the contact details on this slide as well. So feel free to drop me an email or Paula. We will spread that accordingly, or you have the contact already. You can see the contacts as well on our webpage with the public deliverables, so be sure to check by. And we are glad to have followers on LinkedIn and Twitter. And without further ado, if there are no questions, I would thank all of you for participating in this webinar and for organizing that. A big shout out to Deep Blue. That was very well organized and platform is good. And to our presenters, thanks for your time and your detailed presentations. And of course, the simulation exercises that were very busy times while preparing that. And I'm looking forward for the final conclusions in the project and the final steps we will undertake. Thank you all. Have a good day and see you around next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunnar.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think you can close the camera, and as soon as we have no more participants, we will close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.